Frank Miller sat in his usual corner booth at Rosie's Diner, the same spot he had occupied every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years. The old man's weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee, his eyes watching the world go by through the rain-streaked window. At 78, Frank moved slowly, his left leg dragging slightly from an old injury that never quite healed right. The diner buzzed with its usual morning crowd. Office workers grabbed quick breakfast before rushing to their jobs. Construction workers filled up on hearty meals before long days. And retirees like Frank enjoyed the simple pleasure of hot coffee and warm conversation. Rosie Martinez, the diner's owner, moved between tables with practiced ease, her smile genuine as she checked on each customer. Frank had become something of a fixture at the diner. He arrived precisely at 7:30 every Tuesday, ordered the same thing, black coffee and wheat toast with butter, and left a modest tip from his small pension. The waitresses knew him by name, and the regular customers had grown accustomed to seeing the quiet old man in the corner. But not everyone appreciated Frank's presence. Brad Stevens, a young businessman in an expensive suit, had been coming to the diner for about 6 months. He always seemed rushed, constantly checking his phone and tapping his fingers impatiently when his order took more than a few minutes. Brad had started to notice Frank, and something about the old man irritated him. "He just sits there for hours," Brad complained to his colleague, Mike, during one of their breakfast meetings. "Takes up valuable space, nurses 1 cup of coffee forever, and honestly, he makes the place look depressing. This used to be a nice spot for business meetings." Mike glanced over at Frank, who was quietly reading a worn paperback book. "He seems harmless enough. Just an old guy enjoying his coffee." "That's the problem," Brad continued, lowering his voice. "This neighborhood is improving. Property values are going up. Places like this need to attract a better clientele, not become a hangout for," he paused, looking for the right words, "people who clearly don't belong in the new direction this area is heading." Frank had good hearing despite his age, and he caught fragments of the conversation. He had heard whispers before, seen the looks from some of the newer customers. But he had served his country for 26 years in the military, worked construction for another 30 after that, and paid his taxes faithfully. He belonged anywhere he wanted to be, as far as he was concerned. The tension started small, but grew each week. Brad would make pointed comments about loitering when Frank was within earshot. He began complaining to the waitresses about slow service, suggesting that resources were being wasted on customers who didn't contribute much to the business. His comments became bolder, and other customers started to notice the uncomfortable atmosphere Brad was creating. One particularly busy Tuesday morning, the diner was packed. Every booth and table was full, and there was a line of people waiting to be seated. Frank sat in his corner booth, having finished his toast and working on his second cup of coffee while reading his book. The morning rush was in full swing, and Rosie was doing her best to manage the crowd. Brad walked in with 2 important clients he was trying to impress. He looked around the crowded diner, and his eyes landed on Frank's booth. The old man was alone at a table that could seat 4 people, and Brad saw an opportunity to make his point. "Excuse me," Brad said loudly, approaching Frank's table. His voice carried across the diner, causing conversations to quiet down. "This is a business establishment, not a library. You've been sitting here for over an hour with 1 cup of coffee. There are paying customers waiting for tables." Frank looked up from his book, his calm blue eyes meeting Brad's aggressive stare. "I'm a paying customer," Frank said quietly, his voice steady despite the public confrontation. "Right," Brad scoffed, gesturing to the nearly empty coffee cup and crumb-covered plate. "You've spent maybe $3, and you're taking up prime real estate during rush hour. This isn't a homeless shelter or a place for old-timers to waste away their day." The diner had gone completely quiet now. Other customers were watching the scene unfold, some looking uncomfortable, others curious about what would happen next. The waitresses had stopped what they were doing, unsure whether to intervene. Frank slowly closed his book and set it down on the table. He had been in plenty of difficult situations in his life, but he had always believed in handling conflict with dignity. "Young man, he said, his voice still calm, but with an edge of authority that made Brad take a small step back. I've been coming here for 3 years. I pay for my food, I tip fairly, and I treat the staff with respect. I suggest you do the same. Brad's face reddened. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way, especially not by someone he considered beneath him socially. Listen, old man, this is 2024, not 1950. This neighborhood is changing, and businesses need customers who actually contribute to the bottom line. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at a senior center or somewhere that caters to your demographic. The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Frank felt the familiar surge of anger he had learned to control decades ago in the military. But before he could respond, Rosie Martinez stepped out from behind the counter. "Is there a problem here?" Rosie asked, her voice polite but firm. She was a small woman, but she had been running a business in a tough neighborhood for 15 years, and she knew how to handle difficult situations. Brad turned to face her, confident that as a business owner, she would support his position. "Yes, actually, there's a problem. I come here regularly for business meetings, and I bring clients here because it's usually a professional environment. But having people camping out at tables for hours with minimal orders is hurting your business and driving away customers like me who actually spend money." He gestured toward Frank dismissively. "I'm trying to do you a favor by pointing out that you're enabling behavior that's not good for your establishment's image." Rosie looked at Frank, who had remained seated throughout the confrontation, then back at Brad. Her expression was unreadable, but those who knew her well could see the fire building behind her dark eyes. "Mr. Stevens," she said, and Brad was surprised she remembered his name, "I appreciate your concern for my business, but I think there might be some things you don't understand about my customers." The diner remained silent, everyone waiting to see how this would play out. Frank sat quietly, his hands folded on the table, watching Rosie with interest. He had always liked the diner owner, but he had never seen her handle a situation quite like this. "What I understand," Brad said, his voice rising slightly, "is that this is a business, not a charity. And businesses succeed by attracting customers who contribute to the bottom line, not by providing free rent to people who have nowhere else to go." The insult was clear, and several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Frank's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent, trusting that Rosie could handle the situation. What happened next would change everything, not just for Frank and Brad, but for everyone in that diner who witnessed it. Because Rosie Martinez was about to reveal something about Frank Miller that none of them knew, something that would make Brad's behavior not just rude, but deeply shameful. And it all started with a simple question that would turn the entire confrontation upside down. Rosie Martinez looked Brad directly in the eyes and asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Mr. Stevens, do you know what a Purple Heart is?" Brad blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected question. "What does that have to do with anything? We're talking about business practices, not military trivia. Just answer the question, please," Rosie said, her tone remaining professional, but with an underlying intensity that made the entire diner pay attention. It's some kind of military medal," Brad answered impatiently. "Look, I don't see how this is relevant to the situation at hand." Rosie nodded slowly. "You're right. It is a military medal. It's given to service members who are wounded or killed in combat while serving their country. The recipient doesn't ask for it, doesn't apply for it, and usually wishes they never had to earn it." Frank shifted slightly in his seat, beginning to understand where Rosie was going with this. His eyes met hers briefly, and he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if asking her not to continue. But Rosie had made up her mind. "Mr. Miller," Rosie continued, still looking at Brad but addressing Frank, "would you mind showing Mr. Stevens your Purple Heart?" The diner went completely silent. Frank sighed deeply, the sound carrying years of weariness. "Rosie, that's not necessary." "I think it is," she replied firmly. "I think it's very necessary." Brad looked confused, glancing between Rosie and Frank. "What are you talking about? What does any of this have to do with him taking up space in your restaurant?" Frank slowly reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a small, faded blue box. His movements were deliberate and careful, as if he was handling something both precious and painful. The box was old, the edges worn smooth from years of handling. "I don't usually carry this with me," Frank said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But today is the anniversary of the day I earned it, so I brought it to show my grandson when I see him later." He opened the box, revealing the distinctive purple and gold medal inside. The heart-shaped medal seemed to glow under the diner's fluorescent lights, and suddenly, the busy restaurant felt like a sacred space. Brad stared at the medal, still not fully grasping the significance. "Okay, so he's a veteran. That's nice and all, but it still doesn't give him the right to treat your business like his personal living room." The reaction from the other customers was immediate and visceral. Several people gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief, and one older man actually stood up from his table as if he was about to intervene physically. But Rosie wasn't finished. Her voice grew stronger, carrying clearly to every corner of the diner. "Mr. Stevens, this medal represents something that I don't think you understand. Mr. Miller didn't just serve in the military. He served in Vietnam, where he was wounded trying to save members of his unit who were trapped behind enemy lines." Frank's face tightened. These weren't stories he liked to tell, memories he preferred to keep private. But he could see that Rosie felt this moment was important, and he trusted her judgment. "He spent 14 months in military hospitals recovering from his injuries," Rosie continued. "Injuries that still affect him today, which is why he walks with that slight limp you might have noticed." Brad's confident demeanor was beginning to crack. He looked around the diner and saw that every single person was staring at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright anger. "But that's not even the most important part," Rosie said, her voice now carrying a tone of deep respect. "Mr. Miller comes here every Tuesday because Tuesday is the day his unit was ambushed in Vietnam 51 years ago. He comes here because being around people, being part of a community, helps him deal with memories that most of us can't even imagine." Frank closed the metal box and returned it to his pocket. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but carried the weight of decades of difficult memories. "I lost 7 friends that day," he said simply. "Good men with families, with futures. I survived, they didn't. So yes, I come here every Tuesday. Not to take up space or hurt anyone's business, but because sitting alone with those memories isn't something I can do anymore." The truth hit the diner like a physical force. Several customers were wiping their eyes, and even the tough construction workers at the counter were looking down at their plates, clearly moved by Frank's words. Brad, for the first time since the confrontation began, seemed to realize the magnitude of his mistake. His face had gone pale, and his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. But Rosie still wasn't finished. She had more to reveal about Frank Miller, things that would make Brad's behavior even more difficult to defend. And what she said next would completely change how everyone in that diner viewed the quiet old man in the corner booth. "There's something else you should know about Mr. Miller," Rosie said, and Frank looked at her with surprise, wondering what else she could possibly know about his past. What Rosie revealed next would not only shock Brad and everyone else in the diner, but it would also explain why Frank's presence there meant so much more than anyone had realized. The quiet veteran's story was far from over, and the most important part was yet to be told. The revelation would make it clear that Brad hadn't just insulted a random elderly customer. He had attacked someone whose sacrifice and character represented the very best of what America could be. And everyone present was about to learn exactly what that meant. Rosie looked around the silent diner, then back at Frank with an expression of deep admiration. "What you also don't know, Mr. Stevens, is that Mr. Miller is the reason this diner is still here." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Rosie, please." "No, Frank," she said firmly, using his first name for the first time in front of customers. "People need to hear this." She turned to address the entire diner, her voice carrying to every corner of the restaurant. 3 years ago, when Mr. Miller first started coming here, my husband had just died suddenly. Heart attack at 52 years old. I was drowning in debt, behind on the mortgage for this place, and ready to close down permanently. The customers listened intently, many of them unaware of the struggles Rosie had faced. Brad stood frozen, beginning to sense that a situation was getting worse by the minute. I was here one night, after closing, crying over the bills I couldn't pay, when Mr. Miller knocked on the door. I thought I'd forgotten to lock up, but when I let him in, he said he'd seen the lights on and wanted to make sure everything was okay. Frank was looking down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but Rosie continued. When he saw me crying, he asked what was wrong. I don't know why, but I told him everything. About losing Roberto, about the debt, about how I was going to lose the diner that had been our dream for 20 years. She paused, her own eyes beginning to well up with tears at the memory. Mr. Miller listened to everything I had to say. Then he got up, walked to his truck, and came back with a checkbook. He wrote me a check for $40,000. $40,000, Mr. Stevens. Enough to catch up on the mortgage and keep this place running. Gasps echoed throughout the diner. Even the kitchen staff had come out to listen, and everyone was staring at Frank with amazement and newfound respect. Brad's mouth had fallen open. $40,000? He whispered. But that's not all. Rosie continued, her voice growing stronger. When I tried to refuse the money, saying I couldn't possibly accept such generosity from a stranger, you know what he told me? She looked directly at Frank, who was still studying his hands. He said that Roberto and I had built something beautiful here, a place where people could come together, where everyone was welcome, where a cup of coffee could make someone's day a little better. He said places like this were rare and worth saving. Frank finally looked up, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. It wasn't charity, Rosie. It was an investment in something important. He made me promise to pay it back when I could. Rosie continued. No interest, no timeline, just when I could manage it. And you know what? I did pay it back, every penny, over the next 2 years. She walked closer to Brad, her expression serious. But here's the thing, Mr. Stevens. Even after I paid him back, Mr. Miller kept coming here every Tuesday. Not because he wanted special treatment, not because he felt entitled to anything, but because he genuinely cares about this place and the people in it. Frank spoke up, his voice still quiet, but with an authority that made everyone listen. I've been blessed in my life, son, he said to Brad. I had a good career after the military, made some smart investments, and my wife and I lived modestly. When she passed 5 years ago, I found myself with more money than I needed and a lot of lonely hours to fill. He gestured around the diner. This place reminds me of the diners I used to visit with my unit when we were stateside. Places where people took care of each other, where everyone belonged. That's worth protecting. Brad looked around the diner and saw that every single person was watching him with a mixture of disappointment and expectation. He began to realize that his comments hadn't just been rude. They had been deeply ignorant. I didn't know, he stammered, his earlier confidence completely gone. Of course you didn't know, said an older woman from a nearby table, her voice sharp with disapproval. You didn't bother to find out. You just made assumptions based on how someone looked. A construction worker at the counter turned around on his stool. That man saved this place, and you wanted to throw him out because he doesn't spend enough money? What's wrong with you? But Rosie held up a hand to quiet the growing chorus of criticism. There's more to the story, she said, and everyone fell silent again. Frank looked at her with surprise. Rosie, what else could there possibly be? She smiled at him with genuine affection. The scholarship program. Frank's eyes widened. You don't need to talk about that. Yes, I do, Rosie said firmly. She turned to address the diner again. For the past 2 years, Mr. Miller has been quietly paying for a scholarship program for local high school students who want to go to culinary school or study business. Kids whose families can't afford college. Kids who work here part-time and have dreams of opening their own restaurants someday. The revelation hit the room like another wave of shock. Brad felt his knees go weak, and he had to lean against the nearest table for support. 3 students so far, Rosie continued. Maria Santos, who's now at the Culinary Institute. Tommy Chun, who's studying business at the community college and wants to open a food truck, and Jessica Williams, who just started her first semester studying restaurant management. Frank was shaking his head slowly. You promised you wouldn't tell anyone about that. I promised I wouldn't tell anyone while you were helping them, Rosie corrected. But people need to understand who they're dealing with here. She looked directly at Brad, her expression serious but not unkind. Mr. Stevens, you came in here today and suggested that Mr. Miller doesn't belong in this neighborhood because it's improving. You complained that he doesn't contribute enough to the bottom line. You talked about him like he was some kind of burden on society. The weight of Brad's mistakes was becoming overwhelming, but Rosie wasn't finished. What you failed to understand is that Mr. Miller has contributed more to this community in 3 years than most people do in a lifetime. And he's done it quietly, without asking for recognition or special treatment. Frank finally spoke up again, his voice gentle but firm. The reason I don't talk about these things isn't because I'm ashamed of them. It's because that's not why I do them. I do them because it's the right thing to do, because I can, and because this community has given me a place to belong when I needed it most. The truth was now completely clear to everyone in the diner. Brad hadn't just insulted an elderly customer. He had attacked a man who had literally saved the business he was eating in, who had quietly helped multiple young people achieve their dreams, and who had served his country with distinction and sacrifice. But the story wasn't over yet. What happened next would determine whether this confrontation would end with understanding and growth, or with lasting division and regret. And it would reveal something important about the character of every person who witnessed this moment. The silence in the diner was deafening. Brad Stevens stood frozen, his face pale, as the full weight of his behavior crashed down on him. Around him, customers were shaking their heads, some whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Frank Miller looked up at Brad with eyes that held no anger, only a quiet sadness that somehow made the young businessman feel even worse. Son, Frank said softly, I want you to know that I don't hold this against you. You didn't know my story, and you made assumptions. We all do that sometimes. Brad's hands were shaking now. He looked around the diner, seeing the disappointed faces of people he had been eating breakfast with for months without really noticing them. The construction workers who started their days here, the nurses from the nearby hospital grabbing coffee between shifts, the retired teachers who met here for their weekly catch-up sessions. Mr. Miller, Brad finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I was completely wrong. Apologies are a start, said the older woman who had spoken earlier. But words are easy. It's actions that matter. Frank turned to look at the woman, recognizing her as Mrs. Patterson, a retired librarian who came in every Wednesday. Now, Helen, let's give the young man a chance to process this. Brad looked at Frank with amazement. Even after being publicly humiliated and insulted, the old veteran was still defending him. Why? Brad asked, genuinely confused. Why are you being kind to me after what I just did? Frank was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Because I've seen what happens when people let anger and division take over. I've seen communities torn apart, families destroyed, good people turned against each other. It doesn't lead anywhere good. He gestured to the empty seat across from him in the booth. Would you like to sit down? I think we need to have a real conversation. Brad hesitated, acutely aware that everyone in the diner was watching. But something in Frank's manner, the complete absence of malice, the genuine invitation for dialogue, made him move toward the booth. As Brad sat down, Rosie quietly asked the other customers to give them some space. Gradually, conversations resumed throughout the diner, though everyone remained aware of the important discussion happening in the corner booth. I need to understand something, Brad said, looking directly at Frank. How are you not angry with me? I said terrible things about you in front of all these people. Frank smiled slightly, the first time he had shown any emotion other than calm patience throughout the entire confrontation. I'm 78 years old, he said. I've been angry plenty of times in my life, and I've learned that it's usually the person holding the anger who suffers the most. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had learned hard lessons through experience. Besides, I recognize something in you that I used to see in myself when I was younger. You're successful, you work hard, and you've been taught to measure worth by certain standards. But those standards don't always tell the whole story about a person's value. Brad felt tears welling up in his eyes. I don't understand. You should hate me. Everyone in here should hate me. Hate is a waste of energy, Frank replied simply. And you know what? I think deep down, you're a decent person who made a mistake. A big mistake, but still just a mistake. He paused, looking out the window at the busy street beyond. The question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned today? Brad wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring anymore who saw him crying. I don't know. I feel like such a fool. I thought I had everything figured out, thought I knew what success looked like, what kind of people mattered. Success isn't a bad thing, Frank said gently. Ambition isn't a bad thing, but they can blind you to other important things if you're not careful. He pointed around the diner. Look around you. Really look. See the nurse over there? She works 16-hour shifts at the hospital and still stops by to check on Mrs. Patterson when she's feeling lonely. The construction foreman at the counter? He's been teaching his crew basic English after work because 2 of them are immigrants trying to build better lives for their families. Brad followed Frank's gaze, beginning to see the diner's customers as individuals rather than just background noise to his busy life. The young mother in the corner booth is working 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school. The old man reading the paper has been delivering meals to homebound seniors for the past 10 years, entirely as a volunteer. Frank leaned back in his seat. Every person in here has a story, son. Most of them are stories of people doing their best, trying to take care of their families and their communities. Some of them are heroes in ways that would surprise you. Brad looked down at his hands. I never bothered to notice any of that. I was too focused on my own stuff. That's human nature, Frank said. We all get caught up in our own lives. But the good news is that it's never too late to start paying attention. As they talked, Brad began to understand not just the magnitude of his mistake, but the opportunity it represented. This moment could be the beginning of a fundamental change in how he saw the world and his place in it. Mr. Miller, Brad said finally, I want to do something to make this right. Not just apologize, but actually do something meaningful. Will you help me figure out what that should be? Frank studied the young man's face, looking for signs of sincerity. What he saw there was genuine remorse and a real desire to learn and grow. That depends, Frank said. Are you asking because you feel guilty or because you want to become a better person? The question hit Brad like a physical blow. He realized that for the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his adult life, someone was asking him to examine his real motivations rather than just his surface intentions. I think, Brad said slowly, I want to become a better person. I don't like who I was today. I don't want to be that person anymore. Frank nodded slowly. That's a good start. But becoming a better person isn't something that happens overnight. It takes work, and it takes time, and it means changing some fundamental things about how you approach life. I'm willing to do that work, Brad said. And for the first time since the confrontation began, he felt a small sense of hope. What Frank said next would set Brad on a path he never could have imagined when he walked into the diner that morning, a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, community, and what it really means to make a difference in the world. Frank looked at Brad thoughtfully, weighing his words carefully. If you really want to make a change, it starts with understanding that being part of a community means more than just living in the same neighborhood as other people. He gestured toward the window, where the bustling street showed people going about their daily lives. Real community happens when people start caring about each other's well-being, when they look for ways to lift each other up instead of just competing for their own advantage. Brad nodded, though Frank could see he was still processing the enormity of what had happened and what it meant for his future. Tell me about your work, Frank said, changing direction. What do you do? I'm a real estate developer, Brad answered. I specialize in buying older properties and converting them into upscale housing or commercial spaces. Frank raised an eyebrow. Interesting. So you're part of the gentrification process you mentioned earlier. Brad shifted uncomfortably. Yes, I suppose I am. I always thought of it as improving neighborhoods, making them more valuable. And what happens to the people who are already living in those neighborhoods? Frank asked gently. The question hung in the air as Brad considered it seriously for the first time. I never really thought about that part, he admitted. I focused on the economics, the property values, the return on investment. Frank nodded. That's honest. And honesty is important if you want to make real changes. He leaned forward slightly. Here's what I'm thinking. You have skills and resources that could be used to help communities instead of just profiting from them. What if we could find a way to combine your business experience with a genuine desire to support the people who are already part of these neighborhoods? Brad's eyes lit up with interest. What do you have in mind? Well, Frank said, this diner sits in a building that Rosie owns, but there are 2 empty apartments upstairs that she can't afford to renovate. She's been trying to figure out what to do with them for years. Brad looked around the diner with new eyes, beginning to see possibilities instead of just problems. What if, Frank continued, instead of looking for ways to push out existing community members, developers like you look for ways to create affordable housing that actually serves the people who are already here? The idea was revolutionary for Brad, completely opposite to his usual approach to business. You're talking about making less profit, he said, though his tone suggested he was intrigued rather than dismissive. I'm talking about making a different kind of profit, Frank replied. The kind that comes from building something meaningful that lasts. Rosie, who had been listening from a respectful distance, approached the table. Excuse me for interrupting, she said, but I couldn't help overhearing. Frank, are you talking about the apartments upstairs? I am, Frank confirmed. I was just explaining to Brad here about your situation. Rosie looked at Brad uncertainly. After what had just transpired, she wasn't sure she wanted his involvement in her business. Brad sensed her hesitation and spoke up immediately. Mrs. Martinez, I know I have no right to ask anything of you after my behavior today, but if there's a way I could help with those apartments, not for profit, but as a way to start making amends for my ignorance, I'd like to try. Rosie studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity. What she saw there, combined with Frank's apparent willingness to work with him, convinced her to listen. What did you have in mind? She asked. Brad looked at Frank, then back at Rosie. I could handle the renovation costs and the construction management. We could turn those apartments into affordable housing for people in the community who need it, maybe working families or students or seniors on fixed incomes. Frank smiled, seeing the potential in Brad's suggestion. That's exactly the kind of thinking I was hoping for. But, Brad continued, I want to do this right. I want to learn about what the community actually needs, not just what I think they need. And I want Frank to help guide the process, to make sure we're really serving people rather than just feeling good about ourselves. Rosie looked at Frank, who nodded encouragingly. There's a young woman who works here part-time, Rosie said slowly. Single mother, trying to finish her degree. She's been looking for affordable housing closer to the campus, so she doesn't have to spend 2 hours a day on the bus. And there's an elderly couple who've been priced out of their neighborhood, Frank added. Good people who just need a decent place to live at a price they can manage. Brad felt the excitement building that was different from anything he had experienced in his business career. Instead of focusing on maximizing profit, he was thinking about maximizing benefit to real people with real needs. How do we start? He asked. Over the next hour, the 3 of them outlined a plan that would become a model for community-focused development. Brad would provide the capital and expertise, Frank would offer guidance and oversight to ensure the project stayed true to its community-serving mission, and Rosie would help identify and screen potential tenants who would truly benefit from affordable housing. But more than just the apartments, they discussed creating a broader initiative that would bring together local business owners, developers, and community members to find ways to grow and improve the neighborhood without displacing the people who made it special. As they talked, other customers began to join the conversation. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that she had been a social worker before retiring and could help with tenant screening and support services. The construction foreman offered to do some of the work at cost. The nurse suggested connecting with the hospital to identify healthcare workers who needed affordable housing. What had started as a confrontation about belonging and worth had transformed into a community planning session, with Frank Miller at the center as both the catalyst and the wise guide. As the morning crowd began to thin out and people headed to their jobs, Brad realized that his life had fundamentally changed in the space of 2 hours. The man he had tried to force out of the diner had become his mentor and partner in something more meaningful than any business deal he had ever made. "Frank," Brad said as they prepared to leave, "I have one more question." "What's that, son?" "Will you let me buy you breakfast next Tuesday? I'd like to make this a regular conversation." Frank smiled, the first truly bright smile he had shown all morning. "I'd like that. But next Tuesday we're not just talking. We're rolling up our sleeves and getting to work." As Brad walked out of Rosie's diner that morning, he understood that he had been given a rare gift, the opportunity to transform a moment of personal failure into the beginning of a life dedicated to serving something larger than himself. And Frank Miller, the quiet veteran who had nearly been asked to leave, had once again served his community, this time by helping a young man discover what it really meant to belong to something worth protecting. 6 months later, the renovated apartments were home to 3 families who had become integral parts of the diner's extended community. Brad had started a nonprofit organization focused on community-centered development, with Frank serving as its advisory board chairman. But most importantly, every Tuesday morning, you could find them both at Rosie's Diner, in Frank's usual corner booth, planning their next project to make their neighborhood a place where everyone truly belonged.